Welcome to Wednesday evening with the Clear Mountain Monastery community. This evening, Ajahn Nisabho and I are both very happy to have Guy Armstrong joining us. Guy, thanks for being with us this evening.
Pleasure to be with you and to see you again.
Yeah. So we only just really kind of connected with Guy in the last month or two, but it's really been a joy. Ajahn Nisabho and I've seen his books in probably most every monastery I've lived at, but really hadn't taken the opportunity to read them until recently, but am finding it quite enjoyable. So Guy, just to start with, we'll read your biography and then we'll just jump into some questions. So,
Sure.
Guy Armstrong has been practicing insight meditation for over 30 years. His training included ordination as a Buddhist monk in Thailand, primarily with Ajahn Buddhadasa in the early 1980s. He began teaching more broadly in 1984 and has led retreats in the US, Europe, and Australia. Guy is a stewarding teacher at Spirit Rock and a guiding teacher of Insight Meditation Society, and is the author of Emptiness, a practical guide for meditators. So, Guy, could you just fill out some of those details? How did you come to be a practitioner of insight meditation for over 30 years? How did you first get into that realm? And maybe up to the point where you took ordination with Lumpur Buddhadasa?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I should update that bio because now it's well over 40 years. So a little update. It was interesting. I went to a yoga class in Palo Alto in 1974, and the teacher also taught Vipassana that she'd learned from Theravāda, who was a Thai monk back then. I went for the yoga, but I really stayed for the meditation. I got very interested in that. And then about a year later, I saw an ad in our spiritual bookstore in Palo Alto for a meditation retreat with Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, and Jack Kornfield down in New Mexico. So I wanted to take my practice to the next level. I threw my stuff in the car, got 3 friends, and we all drove down and did a 9-day retreat at Lama Foundation, which was established by Ram Dass in New Mexico. I was really taken by intensive practice. They taught it as a sit, walk kind of retreat. And one of the things that really struck me was every night at 9 p.m. in the last sit, Jack Kornfield would do some Pali chanting that he'd learned from being a monk with Ajahn Chah in Thailand. And I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. So I went up, I had an interview with Jack toward the end of the retreat, and I said, Jack, I love that chanting. I'd like to go to Thailand and become a monk. And he said, well, that's a good idea. You should do that. But first, you should spend 2 years at our new center in Massachusetts. And that will really prepare you better to go to Thailand and be a monk. So I did that. I went to IMS and I did a 6-month retreat to start. And then I went on staff for 2 years. And I loved working there, but I wanted to get back into more practice. And so eventually in late 1981, I left for Thailand. I got connected with Ajahn Panyananda in Nonthaburi. You may know of him. He was a good friend of Ajahn Buddhadasa. Mm-hmm. They have a close connection. And so Ajahn Panyananda sort of put me under the microscope for a few months to check me out, ordained me, and cleared me to go practice in a couple of different places. I first went to a very small Vipassana retreat center up near Chiang Mai called Wat Tom Tong. Spent 3 months there with an Ajahn who didn't speak any English. So I was on my own, and I was glad I'd spent time at IMS. And then I moved down to Wat Suan Mok with Ajahn Buddhadasa, who, as you know, did speak really good English. And so I really enjoyed being in his sphere and listening to his teachings and practicing in a little kuti out in the forest there. So that was 1982.
And would you be able to tell us a bit about Ajahn Buddhadasa? It's some people in the West, quite a few may know of him, but to find someone who lived with him is rare. What was he like, and any stories of our particular faith for you around him?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, he was an unusual kind of monk in that he set his own course. And he was both a scholar and I think more or less self-taught and a very adept meditation practitioner and then teacher. So he had that combination, which is quite rare, I'd say, especially in the Thai forest, of being well established in both scripture and meditation. You probably know teachers who are that combination, but I hadn't met them at that point. He was a very strong figure. And one of the things that was so appealing about him was his open-mindedness. You probably see the thangka that's behind me here on the wall. It says a Tibetan wheel of life or Baba Chakra. The first place I ever saw that thangka was at Ajahn Buddhadasa's. Mm-hmm. He had a whole building called the Spiritual Theater, where he collected works of art from all sorts of Buddhist traditions. This was one of them. He had reproductions of Chinese paintings in the Chan style and some Japanese scrolls. So he was very open to all the different Buddhist schools. I really appreciated that. Open-mindedness really resonated with me as a Westerner. He was not dogmatic at all, but he had a very deep meditation practice, and so he would teach us that. In the evenings, he would give teachings to the Westerners who were there. There were about 6 of us at the time, including a couple of people that you both know. Rodney Smith was there for that wasa. And Gary Buck, who I know Ajahn Kovilo has a good friendship with. And also Carol Wilson, who's an old friend and co-teacher of mine. So the 6 of us would go down and hear teachings. And during that time, he was focusing on the aggregates and impermanence. So he was giving us a lot of instruction about noticing the rise and fall of the aggregates and noticing the impermanence of that whole experience. So I just really enjoyed getting to know him that way. And the other thing that was so unusual for me anyway, for someone who was the abbot of a monastery, after breakfast, and this was probably then about 10 o'clock in the morning, he would just sit outside on a bench outside his kuti, which was up at the front of the wat, and just hang out. And I suppose he was meditating, but it wasn't formal. He was just sitting there, and the temple dogs were running around. They always barked at the Westerners. They didn't like us very much. But you could just go up and kneel on the ground in front and ask any Dharma questions you had in mind. So he was just very open and available. I really appreciated that also about him.
When you mentioned the spiritual theater, I'm reminded of one monk I knew who I think stopped into Swanmok and mentioned one piece of art of a sort of beaming monk saying, "What bliss to find there's no happiness in the world." Was that a piece of art there, or do you any reflections on that one, Guy?
Yes, it was. I'd heard that story before. I think Jack may have known that monk and had told the story during one of his retreats at IMS. And then I was surprised to see it up on the wall at the Spiritual Theater. I think it was a Western monk who said that, one who had spent a lot of time in retreat in Thailand.
Right. Maybe Ajahn Bajiro. Actually, he tells that story as well.
What does it mean, Guy?
Well, I think it's to undercut the gaining mind. You know, when people think that they're going to use meditation to get happy and pursue a goal, using the meditation to pursue a goal of becoming happy, when in fact, happiness opens up in meditation when you let go of the goal and just accept the moment the way it is. That's the way I understand it, letting go of the goal.
Yeah, that's beautiful. These days, there's a kind of a Buddhadasa museum and meditation center in Bangkok called BIA, Buddhadasa Indapanyo Archives. And they've kind of redone that spiritual theater. But Buddhadasa he is, as you note, a very interesting teacher in that he's, in many ways, very orthodox Theravada. You know, he did do a lot more study than most of the forest monks in the tradition that we ordained in. But he was also, as you noted, very open. Like he was one of the few monks, at least the only Thai monk that I've seen actually photographed with the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama briefly visited Thailand. And I'm curious about just your exposure to Mahāyāna, just reading your book, Emptiness, and knowing a little bit more about your biography. I'm curious when and how the kind of sphere of Mahāyāna entered into your Dhamma life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about 1992, Joseph and Sharon traveled overseas and met Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, who was a great Dzogchen master of the last century and was living in a small monastery outside of Kathmandu. And they were very impressed by him. He was teaching Dzogchen to them. They came back and spoke quite a bit about them. And the next year, 1993, one of his sons, Soni Rinpoche, came to California and led a Dzogchen retreat. I think it was a 9-day Dzogchen retreat. And I had been curious about that practice ever since hearing from Joseph and Sharon. So I signed up for the retreat, and about half the retreatants were Vipassana practitioners. So it was a good turnout from our Bay Area community. And I really appreciated the teachings that Soni Rinpoche gave. I think he was 26 at the time, but he already had a really wonderful combination of wisdom and heartfulness. He was one of the first teachers I'd met who had a powerful combination of both of those two. He sort of radiated happiness and loving kindness, and yet he could go into details of Nagarjuna's dialectic, you know. So I was very impressed with him at that time, and I started to do some practice in that lineage. I practiced with Soni Rinpoche a few times. And as I was listening to him, because he would be talking about emptiness and the nature of mind, and we'd be chanting the Vajrasattva mantra, 100-syllable mantra to this, awakened archetype. And I sort of went, wait, I know the Four Noble Truths. How did Buddhism get from there to here? So that really inspired me to study the intervening centuries and how the Mahāyāna grew up and then how Vajrayana unfolded from the Mahāyāna and from the early Buddhist teachings as well. It was all a continuum.
Yeah, your book does a good job of explaining some of that history and the actual practicality of it. I'm curious, am I remembering correctly that you had a hand in, or at least attended, the retreat which Ajahn Amaro taught with Tsoknyi Rinpoche, from which the book Small Boat, Great Mountain was produced?
Yes. At Spirit Rock, we all came to appreciate Soni Rinpoche, and we invited him to teach there. And we wanted to pair him with a Vipassana teacher to act as kind of a translator, because it is a jump from the Four Noble Truths to chanting mantras to Vajrasattva. So Ajahn Amaro offered to teach with him, and we thought that would be a great fit, the Tulku and the Bhikkhu. So he taught that retreat. I was happy to participate, and then I wrote the foreword for his book, Small Boat, Great Mountain. And then after that, I taught retreats at Spirit Rock 3 times with Soni Rinpoche, again in a role of acting as a translator from the Vajrayana into Theravāda language. So that was fun. That was challenging and fun.
I kind of want to focus in on the heart around which all those traditions seem to turn. And it's also the subject we thought would be most useful or meaningful for this interview, which is awareness and emptiness. Just those two things. Maybe to begin with, or to enter into that realm, would you be willing to describe the image that came to you when you were teaching that retreat at Spirit Rock and contemplating the nature of awareness itself? And there's one image that was quite meaningful, I found.
Is this the space image, Bhante?
It's the space image.
Sure. I'll have to preface it a little bit.
Please.
In the teachings of the Buddha, which are my basic reference point in my Bible, consciousness is always described as impermanent. Viññana, one of the 5 aggregates, comes and goes like everything else. And in the schools of Tibetan, Dzogchen, and Mahamudra, this quality of awareness is considered to have a more ongoing kind of property, not subject to arising and passing. the way that consciousness is described in the early suttas. So some people resonate with the Tibetan explanation of awareness as something that has more of a lasting nature and something that isn't subject to arising and passing. In the suttas, there's only one element that's not subject to arising and passing, and that's nibbana. And so most of our background was in the Pali Suttas, and then this Mahāyāna view came along of something in awareness that's ongoing. And I was trying to think how I could reconcile those two or explain both of those to my students, to teaching a class out of Spirit Rock. And this image came to me upon waking one night when I'd been sort of thinking about this question. And it involves what I called a thought experiment. And so I ask you to imagine that you're on the edge of our solar system. You're looking out away from the sun, your back is to the sun, and you're looking, just for a thought experiment, you're looking into a portion of the sky that doesn't have any stars. So where you look, there's no stars, so it just looks black. And it's not like a crayon colored black, it's just the absence of light. But in fact, is there light in that space beyond you? Your back's to the sun. Light is coming from the sun, and it's actually pervading that whole space in front of you, but you don't see it. And then imagine that all of a sudden a meteorite passes by, it comes up from below and goes out of your field of vision above. Do you see it? Yeah, because what you're actually seeing is the reflected sunlight bounces off the meteorite and comes to your eye. So this to me is an analogy. The sunlight pervading empty space is an analogy for something that's not changing. It's also nice that it's completely empty. Light doesn't have any mass. So it's a formless kind of energy that's pervading this empty space. Its nature is light. But when the meteorite arises, that flash of seeing is an analogy for sense consciousness. The element of contact, the coming together of the eye and the visual form and the light. And then it makes a sense impression and then it's gone. So the sense consciousness is connected to the flash of light of the meteorite, but then it's gone. And the sunlight pervading empty space is something more ongoing that is, you might say, the fundament of consciousness, that from which sense consciousness arises. So I like that image because it kind of combines the ongoingness, sunlight pervading empty space, with the flash of cognition that happens with sense consciousness.
I thought that was such a beautiful image. And in the book, it's very close to the one the Buddha gave us, maybe his almost clearest image of light that lands on nothing. If light enters through the eastern window, where does it land? On the wall. If there's no wall, where does it land? On the ground. On the water. If there's no water, where does it land? It does not land, Lord. And I've always found that so powerful, not just because light doesn't have mass, but also photons don't experience time. Space, all matter is moving through space-time at the speed of light, and a light particle doesn't experience time. So, but I found that thought experiment the clearest articulation I'd heard of that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe just to go at least one step back is you point something out which I'd never really fully put my finger on, is that the word awareness, which you'll hear a lot in modern day meditation circles or among spiritual people, actually doesn't have a very clear Pali equivalent. But you say you do find, and I find as well, that it is a useful term. Could you speak to this truth that you can't really find an exact Pali term for it? Maybe what other words could be for it, but then why it's still useful, and maybe how that might translate into experience and possibly into your understanding of other Buddhist schools.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Awareness is kind of an evocative word for us as native English speakers. it has deep roots. I've forgotten for the time being what the word is drawn from, but it has a deep resonance for us. And it has a little quality of intelligence also. The fact that there's no Pali equivalent, exact equivalent, has meant that Western teachers have used it in a variety of ways. And sometimes it's used as a synonym for mindfulness. So if you listen to some teachers talking about awareness and you tune in, they may use it for mindfulness. I'd say especially Chittanupassana, the third foundation in the Satipatthana. Personally, I think the word mindfulness does well in those situations, and I like to reserve awareness to point to consciousness, the sort of basic cognizant faculty that all sentient beings have. So if I was going to look for the closest equivalent in the Pali Suttas to the way that I tend to use awareness now, it would be viññānaṁ anantaṁ, boundless consciousness. And there are a couple of nice quotes. You both are probably very familiar with it. The Buddha said, "Where to earth, water, fire, and air find no footing, where consciousness is signless, boundless, and luminous all around." So that's one pointing to that kind of meaning. But the place that I really love to base awareness on today, because my thinking has changed since the book came out, is in Majjhima 121, the shorter discourse on emptiness, where the Buddha steps us through more and more refined openings to emptiness, including boundless space and boundless consciousness. And these are not as formless attainments. It's not that level of concentration of succeeding from the form jhanas into formless attainments. Just the perception of boundless space, perception of boundless consciousness are enough in that discourse to go further and further into emptiness, eventually leading into liberation. So currently, the closest term that I see in the suttas is boundless consciousness to the way that I like to present awareness now. And can I just dwell on that a moment?
Please, we would love that. I would love that.
Dwell away.
So what I love about this term, boundless consciousness, normally viññāna is connected to one sense base. It's the meeting of a sense organ with a sense object, like an eye and a sight, an ear and a sound. Those are considered different consciousnesses, eye consciousness or ear consciousness. So I've noticed some of the monks in your lineage are starting to translate viññāna not just as consciousness, but as sense consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that also, because that shows its impermanent nature very clearly. But it's distinguished from this other kind of consciousness, which is boundless. And what I like about this is it's not only wide and expansive, but when you open up your mind, you open the attention as wide as it will go, you notice that there's more than one kind of sense object happening. Mm-hmm. So the boundless consciousness can include sights and sounds and sensations and moods, etc. So I like the boundless consciousness in the vastness and also the openness to many different types of sense contact.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. Yeah, in our chanting book, the Amarvati chanting book, and we use it up in Clear Mountain as well. Abhayagiri uses it, Parayana, a bunch of places, monasteries use this. In the morning chanting, they translate viññāna as sense consciousness, adding that extra word in there. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a number of places where there's a pericope or a stock phrase, which most people don't know about, called the kasina ayatanas, or the kasina in this sense, not as like a little colored disc, but as its original meaning of totality, the spheres of totality. And one of them is viññānaṁ anantaṁ. And it's one of the few places in the canon where the Buddha actually uses the word advayang, the Pali equivalent of Advaita. So these are non-dual states of this sphere of totality, the unbounded space. So I loved it. Thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'd love to get that sutta reference. Maybe I'll email and request that. Yeah, like it.
Sort of jumping on this train, so to speak, with the you speak about kind of the nature of mind in the sense of emptiness, radiance, and responsiveness. These three kind of together. So, what distinguishes that from in an enlightened being versus an unenlightened being? Like, you speak also about the whole practice as one of descending in, or deepening into emptiness. So, yeah, kind of square. What is the path of practice if we all have this? If there's this substrate there of light, what's the difference, and what's our path to deepening into that space?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the difference is, as it is in the Pali Suttas, whether kilesas are present or not. So you might say the fundamental nature of awareness is the same, but if kilesas are present, then we don't have the clarity to recognize the nature of awareness. So in the practice, as we're teaching it these days, as Sally and I are teaching it, it's all about recognition. And I'll go into the weeds a little bit here.
Please.
So then the question is, what does it mean to recognize that boundless consciousness, or to recognize awareness? The way I understand it is it's a mindfulness practice. Because when you read Majjhima 121, what the Buddha says is that one acquires confidence, steadiness, and resolution in the perception of boundless space and in the perception of boundless consciousness. So this is an experiential meditation. This is not just a philosophical undertaking. Once meditators can recognize awareness in their direct experience, recognize boundless consciousness in their direct experience, then it becomes a meditation practice that truly I consider to be mindfulness of consciousness. So the reason this link is made for me is that, and this is an Abhidhamma reference, which I don't normally take as authoritative, but in this instance, I think it's right. In the Abhidhamma, it said that the proximate cause for mindfulness to arise is a strong perception, sanya. And I think that's accurate. You can think about being with the breath. We have a clear recognition. This is an in-breath. We have a clear recognition. This is an out-breath. That's perception at work. So when we perceive consciousness, when we notice consciousness, and this is possible, this takes some meditative development and training, but it is possible, we become mindful of consciousness. Once mindfulness is inserted into that understanding of the practice, then all the factors of awakening follow on from mindfulness. Mindfulness is the starting point of the 7 factors. So all the other ones unfold. So this is how the practice develops from the recognition of awareness, the mindfulness of awareness. Then it continues to deepen. So when there are strong kilesas in the mind, it's not really possible to recognize awareness clearly. But as the kilesas thin a little bit, it is possible to recognize, and this becomes its own path of practice with the unfolding of mindfulness.
An interesting simile Ajahn Sucitto uses is awareness or consciousness as a river. And he says you don't need to clear away all the junk on the river, but you need to clear away enough of it that you can see the river below the junk.
Nice.
Something like that.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's kind of like that. Mm. And it is really a powerful experiential process for established Vipassana practitioners, because for the most part, it's different in the Thai forest tradition. This is pointed to a lot, from Ajahn Sumedho on. But in the tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, which I've mostly taught in, this isn't really pointed to. So people who've been practicing in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition for 20, 30 years have never turned in this direction with much clarity. So it really is an eye-opener for them.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. I don't know what started the exploration of consciousness, but I do find it, in certain schools of Mahāyāna, specifically in Dzogchen, it really is held as the highest teaching. This is the Adi Yoga, the highest of the high. Mm-hmm. And I think for myself and for other people, there are ways of glimpsing at least some aspect of what I could call, an awareness practice, which is not the highest of the high. It's more interesting than the breath, and it's actually a very doable mechanism. It's not philosophy. It's an actual shift and glimpse of attention. So, do you find that as well, that there's just some people, for whatever reason, not because they're the most concentrated meditators, but it's just some quirk of their psyche that they can tap into this anatta or not self awareness practice more than a concentration or another type of practice?
Yes, Ajahn Kovilo, I agree with everything that you said about it. It is available to meditators. I find especially those who have some years of Vipassana practice behind them, because it needs a certain level of stability of attention. And it's also really helpful if people know how to work with the hindrances. Otherwise, the hindrances will overwhelm the subtlety. Awareness is a very subtle focus. And if the hindrances are very active, that will overwhelm access to it. But if the hindrances are not too active, people are definitely able to tap into this. It's very approachable, very accessible. And then what I see, the vastness of it opens up a huge amount of freedom for people. It's sort of, you go vast, it puts your life and it puts your, hindrances, etc., in a bigger perspective that is really opening for people. It's wonderful.
It's interesting. In Majjhima Nikaya 43, Venerable Sariputta and I think Venerable Kimbala are talking back and forth. Maybe Venerable Kimbala, is it? Another monk. And he says that, upon exiting the cessation of perception and feeling, one can either encounter kind of three doorways to the deathless, either animitta samadhi, and the commentaries say that that's if you're focused on anicca, the base of infinite space, and that's if you're focused on anatta, or the undirected apanidaya concentration, and that's if you're focused on dukkha. And I do find it interesting because there are certain practitioners like Ajahn Kovilo, I think, where that anatta perception is right there and the spaciousness. Whereas for me, dukkha has always been very prominent, and the aspect of like surrender is a very clear metric. One thing I if you have anything to say about that, I'm interested, but I'm really interested in when we talk about, you talk about this ascent into emptiness in the Chula Sunyata Sutta and gaining confidence in these more refined states of mind. And there's a sutta that says the apex of metta is the beautiful, the apex of karuna is the base of infinite space, the apex of mudita is the base of infinite consciousness, rejoicing. And when I think about practitioners steering their heart towards this light, it can be very dry and sterile, at least sounding, for sort of a dry insight or something like that. For me, a lot of what maybe many Christians or theistic religions are tapping into is the base of infinite, at least resonant with that base of infinite consciousness of rejoicing. Maybe not the full experience, but just that experience of faith, of steering the heart towards the divine, and even just that language that's so threaded through Christian language, but in Western Buddhism, which was so much a reaction to Christianity, we really work to make our language very precise, but not very evocative. And Ajahn Suchat has said that, when Thai people think of the word Buddha or Buddho, it invokes in them what the word God invokes in a Westerner. So what about this place? Where do you see this aspect of the heart orienting towards the divine in a much more emotional faith level? Because that's a powerful tool. And I think as Westerners, it's one we kind of have to stumble our way towards, but it's powerful. So what are your thoughts about all that?
I'm with you, Ajahn. One of the things I talk about at the end of a retreat on awareness is the aspect of devotion. And I point to how the monastics have kept it alive with things like chanting and bowing and flowers and incense and so forth. But we've dropped it, for the most part, from lay teachers' retreats, because the whole of our community is kind of in recovery from devotion in the way that we were brought up. and we didn't want to alienate people. But I think it's very important for a sense of faith and heart opening, as you say. So a couple of things. One is, when we can teach awareness the way we like, it's in a month-long retreat. And we start with 9 days on mindfulness of breathing to develop a base of stability of attention. And then we do 5 days on the Brahmaviharas, especially metta, to lead to the juiciness of the heart opening. And then we move into awareness from there, so that the heart qualities are very fresh and alive. And people find, especially if they can practice in nature, and that's why, we love the connection to the Thai forest, that the heart really opens in awareness practice if you're in nature, because the attention is very wide open. When anatta is really seen and the sense of self drops away more, you're really with nature. This is such a theme of the whole Thai forest tradition, learning from nature, which is one of the things Ajahn Buddhadasa used to say, opening to nature. That evokes the heart qualities and devotion. And people feel that really strongly. It comes through very clearly. A lot of, I would say, tears come to people in these kinds of retreats. And the other thing I'd like to touch on is, in that analogy of the sunlight pervading empty space and then the sense consciousness through the meteorite, if there's anything sacred in our lineage, and I'll include the whole of the history of Buddhism, something that is the nature of consciousness and that is, let's say, ever present, that has to represent something close to God or the sacred. It's an element of experience that is part of the universe, as the Buddha described it as an element. And if there's anything we can choose to be devoted to, I think that's a fairly good object. And once you can get the sense of that fundament of awareness as a devotional representation or as an aspect of the sacred, then you start to see that the light off individual sense objects is the same stuff. And that's how the ultimate touches, in its sacredness, touches the everyday sense experience.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, just on the level of nature, going from just the greens, actually, when we do live in a forest, and as you say, yeah, that really is the foundations. That's the first kind of real training in a forest monastery, is just being able to be by yourself in a hut, which is far enough away from another. Basically, you don't see any other huts. You don't see any other people. You go to bed and, you're really by yourself in a forest. Shifting from that to something which you talk about, I thought really interestingly in your book, of the later Mahāyāna concept of Buddha nature, and specifically how sometimes that's talked about as having threefold. There's a threefold nature spoken of in Chinese Mahāyāna and also in Tibetan Buddhism. Could you elaborate for people? Because this was, I read about it before, but I'm curious to hear how you would explain what is the threefold nature, these three aspects of consciousness and of awareness.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Ajahn Kovilo, it's been a while since I've studied Buddha nature from the source, but if I can reply in terms of the threefold nature that we talked about earlier, the way I understand the nature of awareness is that it's a union of emptiness and cognizance, the basic knowing. And when those are recognized, then the responsive quality of the mind or heart shines through. So the way I see the threefold nature is emptiness, cognizance, and responsiveness. So when the heart is clear, emptiness means there's not too much self going on. That's the gradual descent, is about removing more disturbances and removing more selfing. So when the self is relatively absent, then the heart is open to respond with the beautiful qualities of love, insight, compassion, humility, awe, wonder, patience, and so forth. That's kind of how I understand it.
Sort of circling around this aspect of light, bodhicitta, Buddha nature, and devotion, the divine. And Long Prapanyavada did say that if one investigated God at the very end, they would come to awakening. What does the Buddha mean to you? How has it changed? How has your relationship to the Buddha changed over a lifetime of dedicating yourself to his teachings? And when have you felt that the most? Just tell us a little bit, if you would, about your relationship to the Buddha.
Oh, it's a great question. I consider the Buddha my main teacher. I've read all the Buddha Vachana, words of the Buddha that are in the suttas. I haven't read all the Vinaya. But I just still continue to be so inspired by his, what I would just call his perfection. His clarity, his compassion, his depth, his unwaveringness, his freedom from kilesas. One of the things that kind of blows me away is I've read probably close to 2,000 pages of his words in English translations. I'm not a Pali scholar, so I read it in the translations. I don't see any contradictions. For somebody to talk that much about the nature of reality and going into very, very subtle territory like formless attainments and different levels of insight and awakening, and not to contradict himself, and for that degree of precision to have come down to us 2,500 years later, I find it almost incredible. So it's the whole range of his mind, his unbudging from telling us how to get out of suffering. That's what he was all about. So clear.
It's really resonant with your simile of light, seeing as the triple gem in these three aspects of Buddha and Dhamma and Sangha, which hold that light, and just the perfection of a perfectly cut crystal.
Yeah, nice.
So, in speaking about what you admire in the Buddha, which is something which he's really admirable for, is just his great compassion, his Mahakaruna. And that's the last chapter of your book. And it's really kind of the essence of many Buddhist schools, is the Buddha's and practitioners' practice of compassion. And there's oftentimes spoken about this relationship between compassion and emptiness. And I don't actually see the link being drawn explicitly as much in Theravada circles. And I'm curious what your experience of that connection has been, and how that might have changed over the years.
Yeah, I think we will often say something like compassion comes out of emptiness, and it can sound like a little bit of a trite platitude, but I think it's really true. And here, emptiness, particularly in the sense of not self. When we are not so focused on our own situation and problems and concerns and health and so forth, then the heart is just naturally open to respond to where other people are, and to respond to the suffering that's in individuals we meet, that we hear about in the world. So I think this is part of that responsiveness of the nature of awareness, that the heart does come across in that way when it's not too weighted down by self-concern. And the Buddha, just continued to manifest that through 45 years, even when his back hurt. Very impressive.
Have you seen that in yourself or others? How the meditative experience, like on a long retreat, especially if someone is doing a Dzogchen retreat, or maybe some of the retreats that you've taught, we're really dipping into an experiential taste of emptiness, practice of emptiness. How that how that transfers to post-retreat experience. Oftentimes, I think people on a breath retreat or some kind of other very specific object-focused meditation, oftentimes it's quite jarring. You leave the retreat, even if you practice a little bit of metta on day 9, it can be a little bit jarring, but curious about how the meditative experience of emptiness might affect, if it has or if it does, how you've seen that.
Well, I think that awareness practices lend themselves naturally to integration because we are training the mind to stay open. And one of the primary characteristics of that is equanimity, because the spaciousness just creates more room for all of our sense experiences, including difficult emotions, to flow through and be seen in a bigger perspective. I like this line from Ajahn Sucitto, where he said at some point, space is the absence of pressure. Mm-hmm. So when we train in a practice that is intrinsically spacious, we are training to be without pressure, therefore to be equanimous, and going back into a world that is, frankly, pretty crazy right now. We need all the equanimity we can gain. And so I think spacious practices do help to support that. I think object-oriented practices are very, very powerful also, so I'm not trying to compare or dismiss those. But I think one of the features of the spacious practice is equanimity.
Yeah, that harkening back to that sutta of the apex of karuna, compassion is the base of infinite space, and just this subtle sense of claustrophobia and pushing against one another with jagged edges that you don't realize is kind of there all the time. Speaking, Guy, of the, this is a really lovely conversation, by the way.
Thank you.
Speaking of going back into the world and it being a bit crazy, on one level, the world has always been crazy in the time of the Buddha, etc. On another level, it's definitely crazy now as well, and in whole new ways. Just to bring this discussion back to people's day-to-day experience, how do you suggest people navigate living with the current political situation, environmental situation, and news? How do people maintain that place of emptiness, compassion, and equipoise in the midst of the worldly winds, which are going pretty hard?
Oh, it's a great question, Ajahn Nisabho. Thank you for bringing it, because we talked about it quite a bit in our recent retreat. Sally and I just finished up teaching a month-long retreat on awareness practice, and we talked about this quite a bit, especially at the end as people were heading back to the world. So I want to preface it by saying that I was born after World War II. And I lived through the years where in school, we were trained to duck under desks in case a nuclear bomb was falling, which I don't think would have been very helpful. That's all they had to offer. We lived through the Vietnam War, but I've never felt the world in so much crisis as it is now. I've never felt people under so much stress as they are now. So I think this is a really important question, and I'm glad we get to talk about it. So I have a checklist. I have a 6-point checklist that I shared with people at the end of our retreat. So I'll just go through it briefly.
Please.
You all may want to add, I'm sure you have other great tips too. The first thing is to moderate one's intake of news. It's so easy to drown in all the details of the world situation. And it's very hard to maintain, for me, to maintain my own balance and equanimity if I read too much news. So I try to take in headlines and not many stories. Just I know what's going on, but I don't want to know too many details. And I prefer not to watch television because people get more amped up on TV than in print. And the second thing is really important to do formal practice every day. There's nothing like meditation to bring back a sense of balance in the mind. Association with like-minded people seems critical, so we recognize we're not alone in this situation. For me, exercise is really important. It keeps the energy up and positive, and access to nature. Really, talk about those greens and the trees and the forest. It really is a stabilizing force. And the other thing that I've been doing, not everybody will want to do this, is reading quite a bit of history. So I've just finished a book called The Fall of Civilizations, which just tracks something like 20 or 25 empires over the course of 6,000 years, and points out how one inevitable factor is they all collapse at some point due to different causes. And so I find it helpful to have a historical perspective on the times that we're going through. And I'd be curious if you all have other tips also. I love to hear good advice.
Do you have any tips, Ajahn?
Do you want to go first? And
Yeah, you should go first.
Okay. No, I think those are really helpful, Guy. And the history books of sort of seeing the wider perspective, even just the history of the Buddha's time and how he navigated waters of famine, war, King Ajatasattu killing his father, King Bimbisara, and the forgiveness and equipoise. I think often of, my grandparents' generation, the greatest generation, they materially, things were prosperous in a lot of ways, but spiritually, many of them I thought were quite stunted and had, or at least had a lot of difficulty confronting things. And I think, right now I see so many, powerful chittas and people manifesting. I just think there's such potential for awakening here. And the thing that I do think is worth bringing to the fore as well, that we can, as monastics at least, is just a multi-life perspective, rebirth and the idea that this human life is a drop of dew on a blade of grass, and we do what we can, but we expect so much from human rebirth, and it's not always a great thing. I mean, it's wonderful in the sense of practicing, but it's a hard game, and to expect it to provide satisfaction, I find that multi-life perspective and understanding ourselves as part of a much deeper storyline of asasana, which has outlasted empires, and if that's the thread that we're touching into and sustaining, then we're serving our role perfectly, even in the midst of great tumult.
Lovely,
What would you
thank you.
say?
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice for people who can take it. And I think one other thing I would add, which is small and doesn't take very long at all, but is very powerful, is a bowing practice. Even if people aren't Buddhist, just having a shrine with, to whatever is highest in one's life, and then orienting and reorienting oneself to that every morning when they first wake up, every evening before they go to bed. It has a lot of course correcting capacity to it. So
Lovely. Yeah, thank you both.
It helps to live with a monk also. We do lots of that.
Like-minded people.
That's right. Guy, just in terms of history, we have recently read 2 books by a British Buddhist scholar and Buddhist named Sarah Shaw, who we just interviewed. We haven't aired it yet, but she wrote 2 histories of breathing mindfulness, called Breathing Mindfulness, and one called just Mindfulness. And it basically tracks the evolution of this concept of sati or smriti or mindfulness. And it's a fascinating progression. Like when it gets to the Abhidharma Kosha, basically these Tibetan or Sanskrit Abhidhammas, sati, mindfulness, moves from being a occasional wholesome quality to being a quality which is present in every single mind state, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome. So that has a huge effect. It has had a huge effect on the history of Buddhist thought. But in that vein, the first half of this conversation was just about the beauty of awareness practice and the practicality of it and the interestingness of it. And when you look to the Pali, you kind of have to look in certain ways. You have to interpret things in a way which they're not really usually interpreted as, and you can find things there. But as you note, these later traditions talk about it, in extension, and at very great length. But I was impressed that through the whole course of your book and in every interview we've heard you with, you've kind of stuck with this Theravada is your through line. You love the Pali Canon, and I'm curious if you could just speak to that that love, why, if you have an answer to why that is, or just how that's manifested, is why you keep coming back to the Pali, even though there are these other traditions that might speak more with more variegacy to your interests.
Well, I think we can find a lot of it in the Pali Canon, and I'm showing my own prejudice, but I think the Theravada way of practice in the Eightfold Path is maybe the most accessible, applicable, and transformative for Westerners today. You just look at how mindfulness has taken off in a secular setting to see how much benefit so many people are getting from, this small part of what the Buddha's teachings have to offer. So I think the ability to be mindful of the body, ability to be mindful of one's emotions, the calming potential in breath and loving kindness brings so much harmony and groundedness to people in the world today, to Westerners in the world today. I just think it's the right recipe for people. And certainly as people grow up in the Dharma, they want to explore other approaches and find value from other approaches. And I think that's wonderful. And I find it interesting. I think this was a comment from Bhikkhu Analayo in one of his recent books. You take Majjhima 121, which is where we set our practice of awareness as the mindfulness of boundless consciousness. I think he said that Bhikkhu Buddhaghosa in his commentaries didn't even make a comment on that passage. And so it was there in Theravada from the very beginning, but the tradition ignored it and chose not to follow it up. And somehow some seed of that went forward with the Mahāyāna, and they developed it further. I have tremendous respect for the Tibetan lineages. They basically sat on top of the world for 1700 years with nothing else to do but explore the mind. And so their technology with these practices of awareness is superb. But to really go deep in the Tibetan tradition means taking on a lot of practices that aren't so natural a fit for secular Westerners. Like the whole Nundro practice is quite a stretch for a lot of Westerners, and some of the philosophical elements are very different from the way we normally think. So I just think that the humble Theravada is really kind of the perfect medicine for the world today. That's my bias.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I have heard some teachers talk about Vipassana as being a perfect ngondro, preliminary practice.
Us humble Theravadins are the best. It's true. So guys, speaking of humility, we're going to take, we do have some questions in the chat, but we're going to probably take them on Zoom, which we'll be jumping over to in a second, and I'll paste the link into the chat. We will take one comment from Bonnie Duran saying, Guy rocks, all uppercase. So,
hi, Bonnie. Lots of love.
Guy, before we jump over, this has been such a just precious connection and conversation. Maybe the last question for you, do you have a prayer or a wish for those listening? Well, I think what I closed my book with is still something that I feel very connected to. I wish for all of you to maintain your faith in the Buddha Dharma and to continue to deepen your own practice and never to lose sight of all the people in the world who are suffering, and be willing to respond in an appropriate way as you are able.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much, Guy. And please do come and visit us up here in Seattle anytime you can.
Oh, thanks. I'd love to.
Yep. All right. Well, hopefully we'll see as many of you as you can join us over on Zoom. Were you going to say something, Guy?
No, I was just going to ask you. So is this where I click the arrow on the private chat and move over to Zoom?
Yep. We'll just sign off right now. We'll make a pretty exit, and then we can both go over there.
Okay.
Thanks, Guy. Yep.
All right.